So in this video today, I'm going to be showing you the very best of Mac gaming on Steam. So first up, we are looking at Valheim, which is a survival sandbox game made by the Swedish developer Iron Gate Studio. Now this was released on early access in 2021, but it's been in high demand on macOS ever since, and it's finally got a full Mac release as of June 2024. So a lot of people have been reporting that the Mac port runs great even on low-end machines. This has been optimized for the ARM64 chip, and it is absolutely a beautiful game. This is despite its lo-fi aesthetic. The focus really is on the depth of the gameplay mechanics, and also the fact that we can play this up to 10 players multiplayer. And this makes it one of the best new additions to the Mac gaming library on Steam. So next up is the roguelike card game Balatro. So this has easily been one of my favorite entries of the year so far. So on the surface, it doesn't look like gameplay is anything special, but at the heart, it's a very complex and rewarding and satisfying roguelike deck building game. So the basic scoring system and theming looks a lot like poker, but it's actually a lot more complex than that. You basically have to beat ever increasing round scores, following randomized rules. For example, hearts don't count in this particular deck. And every time you beat a boss, you can go to the shop and spend your money and try to keep ahead of the roguelike power curve. Anyway, like any good roguelike, there are dozens, if not hundreds of different items and special cards. They all have very interesting interactions, and it's a game that I constantly come back to, so highly recommend it. Make sure to check out Balatro. So next up is Baldur's Gate 3. Now this game has been constantly updated on Mac. We're now up to patch number 6. This game has won multiple Game of the Year awards at this stage, and it is definitely one of my favorite games of all time and one of the best RPGs ever made. So if you aren't familiar with this game, this is a CRPG or a computer role-playing game, and it's also a tactical team-based RPG as well, which is turn-based. Now I know that doesn't necessarily sound appealing to most people, however it's a formula that really works very well. The story is extremely engaging and very much replayable. There are loads of dialogue and quest options, and I found myself playing through this game a second time, making completely different choices and seeing very different parts of the game which I didn't experience the first time. So there's loads to see here. And not only that, this is a fantastic multiplayer experience as well. So this game is universal binary, so it'll work with Intel and Apple Silicon and Macs, but I do recommend running a machine with over 8GB of RAM, or you're going to struggle with later acts in this game, which are far more graphically demanding. Now, a lot of the issues with the Mac port of this game lagging behind the Windows counterparts and not being able to play multiplayer with Windows users because of patch mismatches. These issues have basically been solved because Larian have brought all of their Mac porting in-house, and so as of the latest patch number 6, the versions are now matching up, and we're promised that patch number 7 onwards is going to be concurrent with the Windows version in the future. So make sure to check this out. It's a great game. So next up is the game Lies of P, which is a Dark Souls-like action role-playing game developed by NeoWiz Games and Round 8 Studios. So this takes a lot of cues from games like Sekiro, Dark Souls, Bloodborne. However, the setting is basically based on Pinocchio, but a more of a kind of sci-fi fantasy historical setting. As a Mac port, this one is pretty unique in being a simultaneous Windows console and macOS release. Not only did they make this a native ARM Apple Silicon game, it also supports advanced Metal FX features and upscaling, and generally speaking, one of the best ports of the year. And generally speaking, not only is this a very well reviewed game, it is also one of the best looking games on the Mac as well. So if you want to see more simultaneous ports like this in the future, then make sure to pick up Lies of P, easily one of the best games of 2023. So next up, we're looking at the game Riven. So this is the remake of the classic sequel to Myst, an absolutely beautiful first-person puzzle adventure game, obviously made by the same creators as Myst, called Cyan Worlds. And what they've basically done is remade this game in full 3D with fully explorable three-dimensional environments, remade in Unreal Engine 5. The live action film sequences have been replaced by fully voiced and animated 3D models, and all of the puzzles and locations have all been kept intact, probably just as you remember them. Anyway, Riven and also Myst as well are both available on Steam. So next up is the space adventure arcade shooter role-playing game and management game called Everspace 2. So unlike Everspace 1, which was a roguelike game which was designed to be repeated and played over and over again with randomized elements, Everspace 2 is more like a traditional RPG. So if you're familiar with a game like Elite, this is a similar game to that, or a more recent example would be something like Freelancer. This is basically an open world space combat combat game in a similar vein to those previous games. There's an in-depth story and long campaign, and at the heart of it, it's all about upgrading your ship, collecting loot, mining, and really developing your character and your ships and your weapons and skills as the campaign continues. Anyway, this is a really fun game with a long campaign. It has great controls and it feels a little bit arcadey, but also quite rewarding and fun. If you want something to scratch that freelancer or even Star Citizen style itch, then this is going to be the game for you on Mac. So next up, we're looking at the game Stray, which is basically a cat simulator stroke puzzle game set in a post-apocalyptic sci-fi world where humans have gone extinct. So this has been one of the most anticipated macOS releases. It's basically a third-person adventure game where you control a stray cat leaping across platforms and climbing up obstacles. You wander around this very intricate, interesting environment which is populated by zergs, which are mutated bacteria. There are a lot of puzzles involving swarms of zergs where you have to try to lead them away from the environment where you're trying to get to, and then you can circumvent them. Similarly, there are also puzzles involving sentinels, which are basically these robot watchers. And basically looks can be deceiving because initially it looks like a relaxing cat simulator type of game, but it can get quite stressful. It's really more of a puzzle stroke stealth game. So if you like that kind of game, then make sure to check this one out. Stray is a great addition to the Mac gaming library. So next up is Layers of Fear, a remake of the 2016 original game, which is basically a seminal first-person horror game developed by Bloober Team. You take control of an artist who has returned to a studio. His initial goal is to complete his masterpiece, and what you have to do is figure out how the task should be accomplished. The game basically involves searching the environment for clues and putting together solutions to the puzzles, and go around exploring this very creepy Victorian mansion, looking for all of the notes and secrets and clues to figure out the full plot of this game. So this remake basically combines Layers of Fear 1 and 2, originally released in 2016, and it's basically a complete rebuild from the Unity engine to Unreal Engine 5 with all of the advanced graphical bells and whistles. A curious thing is that both of the Bloober games, Layers of Fear and also the Medium, have been removed from the App Store, so Steam is basically the only place you're going to get these games from, at least for the Mac. So next up is the game Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader. So this is an isometric turn-based tactical role-playing game developed by Owlcat Games, who also created the Pathfinder RPG series, including Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, which is an excellent macOS RPG as well. So inevitably this is going to draw a lot of comparisons with a game like Baldur's Gate 3. We have a game with a lot of lore, talking, dialogue options, and then also turn-based combat based on a team. And what makes this game unique is its futuristic sci-fi fantasy setting. Also the fact that we can have up to 6 party members instead of Baldur's Gate 3's 4 party members. Similarly, there is cooperative multiplayer gameplay as well. And one of the game's more distinguishing features is its emphasis on realm building, with the player's decisions as the titular rogue trader affecting the rest of the gameplay as they build their space empire. Anyway, this game has literally hundreds of hours of gameplay and plenty of replay value too, so you should definitely check this out if you're a fan of CRPGs on the Mac. So next up is the highly anticipated port of No Man's Sky, and this happens to work fantastically on the Apple Silicon Mac, whether you're running on the base M1 chip or something even more powerful like a Max or an Ultra chip too. If you've not heard of this game before, it's an action-adventure survival game based on procedurally generated worlds, so there are literally trillions of planets that you can visit. All of them are going to be different, and you advance basically by mining for resources, improving equipment, buying and selling resources, using credits, building planetary bases, and expanding space fleets. What's cool is that you can fly around in space and visit any of these planets. There's so much player freedom in this game, and there have been years of development and features added to this game over the years, and it's definitely one of the best additions to the Mac gaming library. So next up is the game Arma 3, a pretty hardcore open world tactical shooter simulation game. Now this had a Mac port back in 2015, but now it's been reintroduced as an Apple Silicon native port as of this year. So what's great about this game is its commitment to realism. So it's very slow paced compared to most shooting games. It has a lot of single player content, but where it really shines is its multiplayer. Now the game can be run either as an Intel binary through the Rosetta 2 translation layer, which you can use to play online, or you can use the Apple Silicon native version, which is not available to play on multiplayer online. So the choice is really yours depending on whether you want to play multiplayer or you want to use the more optimized Apple Silicon native version and just play single player. However, if you want to play a more traditional online multiplayer fast multiplayer shooter, then you might want to check out the next game on the list. So on the Mac, there are no current Call of Duty games which you can play online. So this game, Combat Master, is pretty much the closest that you're ever going to get. So this is a free-to-play first-person multiplayer shooter in the vein of Call of Duty, but one of the main differences is with the actual speed of the game. So when you're running and vaulting and moving and sliding, etc., there's no loss of acceleration, and the speed of the game is very, very fast, and also the time to kill as well. So you'll often kill people in 1 or 2 shots, and basically you can expect to be killed very quickly too, but thankfully the respawning is very fast depending on the mode that you're playing on, and you're never more than a few seconds away from continuing to play the game. And you might notice that the graphics are quite rudimentary as well, and that's because this is a cross-platform mobile game, so you'll be playing with mobile users as well. But I think that this is a good thing because basically you have an advantage when you're playing on the Mac desktop, and it also means that you get very high frame rates when you're playing on a Mac. So this is actually maxed out at 60 FPS on the M1 chip, so that's the base MacBook Air. And so basically this is a very accessible game, so no matter which Apple Silicon Mac that you have, you can basically run this on the ultra quality and you're going to hit the maximum frame rate and have a very good time. So whilst this isn't the deepest game, it does have a healthy multiplayer online community. There is a level up and progression system with interesting weapons and gear to collect, and hopefully this is the game that's going to scratch that multiplayer first person shooter itch where basically no other Mac game can right now. So next up is the latest game in the Tomb Raider series, Shadow of the Tomb Raider. And at its release, this is one of the best Mac ports of 2019, featured by Apple themselves on stage, and also the benchmarking tool gets a lot of use as the graphics still hold up to this day. But at its core, it's a really good third-person adventure action game that also happens to work really well even on the base M1 MacBook Air. So here's the game running at 1080p at medium settings, getting around 25 to 30 FPS. You'll be doing a lot of platforming, adventuring, and third-person combat as well. So this game is the third and final entry in what's called the Survivor timeline. The previous entries in the trilogy, Rise of the Tomb Raider and the first Tomb Raider game, also have excellent macOS ports. If you're looking for games which are a little bit more low end as well, those are great entries in addition to Shadow of the Tomb Raider. So next up is the first person shooter Metro Exodus, and it remains one of the best looking first person shooters on Mac operating system. And you don't need an ultra powerful Mac to play this, even the base M1 runs this game beautifully. Here we're getting a very decent frame rate of about 30 to 35 FPS at 1080p medium settings. Not too bad for a passively called fanless Mac. So the game was released back in 2019 and is one of the finest examples of atmospheric linear first-person shooters on macOS. You'll be continuing the adventures of the character Artyom, who leaves the tunnels of Moscow and travels across the post-apocalyptic wasteland of the former Russian Federation and Republic of Kazakhstan, whilst fighting against mutated creatures and hostile humans. Somewhat like the Tomb Raider trilogy, there is also a Metro trilogy on macOS, and previous entries are also well worth checking out, including Metro Last Light and Metro 2033. But anyway, Metro Exodus is definitely going to be the one that's going to be pushing the maximum graphics of your Apple Silicon Mac. So next up is Isonzo, which is a World War I multiplayer first-person shooter basically set in the Italian front of World War I. Again, this is one of the very few multiplayer first-person shooter games that you can play online. It's more akin to, say, Battlefield than it is to Call of Duty. The movement is relatively slow-paced and you will die quite a lot. I died loads from this game when I tried to play this online. The game really rewards patience and accuracy and teamwork as well. So if you want that kind of game, Isonzo is definitely the one for you. So this is being played on the base M3 chip. We're playing this at medium settings and it seems to run pretty well when you're playing this online. So this game initially released 2022, but it had a Mac port in 2023. It is quite an ambitious game for the kind of scope that we have here. And this is basically a sequel to earlier World War I games, including Verdun and Tannenberg, made by the same developers. But this game doesn't have the biggest player base at the moment. So if you want to support this kind of game on Mac, then make sure to pick it up and to try this out and show your support for the developers and encourage more unique games like this to come out on the Mac in the future. So next up is Total War Warhammer 3, which is the last of the Warhammer 3 trilogy. This was released in February 2022. It is a strategy game with a mix of real-time and turn-based combat. So personally, I'm a big fan of the Total War games. I really like how a lot of the series are represented on macOS. Warhammer 3 is basically the culmination of the entire trilogy of games, and it also contains the Immortal Empire's mega campaign map, which incorporates lands from Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2, so make sure you own those games as well so that you can incorporate those lands and factions. Similarly, the Grand Campaign map is extremely addictive. Each faction has got unique tech trees, each lord has different skills, and there's a lot of grand strategy in this real-time strategy game as well, whether it's about research, diplomacy, or even just strategic and tactical thinking. So out of all the Total War games that you can play on the Mac, definitely check out Warhammer 3. So next up is the retro-looking game Dave the Diver, which is basically an adventure game where you control a player called Dave, a hard-working diver, as he collects fish, manages a sushi restaurant, and solves quests, and the game kind of changes quite a lot as you play the game. I don't want to spoil what happens later too much, but basically you go through the game unlocking recipes to cook, attract influential customers, renovate the restaurant. There are tons of mini games which are unlocked throughout the story, and it's one of the more unique titles on the Mac. So if you're looking for a game which combines elements of management, action adventure, and role-playing, then this is going to be one of the more interesting games for you. It has a really interesting pixel art style, and it really works well with the interesting mini games that come up later, including a rhythm game and a Tamagotchi style game app. Anyway, this game was really well reviewed and well worth checking out. So next up is SnowRunner. So this is the macOS port of the 2020 Windows and console game. Basically, it's an off-roading open world simulation. You have tasks to deliver cargo, complete construction projects and repairs at different locations while driving over pretty rough terrain. So this game's pretty unique. It's not like a standard driving game at all. There's no real racing. It's all about the simulation and terrain physics. Each of the game's regions is set after a disaster has taken place, whether a natural flood or man-made, such as a pipeline breaking. And locations are very varied, taking place in rural regions in beautiful North America or Russia. The game has a pretty huge collection of different trucks, and the game is sort of like an RPG where you have to earn money by completing missions, and then make improvements to your truck, and then make it easier to make further progress in different mission types and terrain types. So if the physics of this game look a bit familiar, it's because the physics engine is developed from the same game as MudRunner and Spin Tires. And whether you find this game fun is really going to depend if you like vehicle simulation games, if you're the kind of guy that likes playing a game like Euro Truck Simulator, for example. Anyway, check this game out if this is your idea of a fun game. So next up is the game Cult of the Lamb. So the game is all about this lamb who's been saved by this mysterious god, and in return you have to build up a cult with a camp full of followers. So the main gameplay loop involves this rogue-like action dungeon area where you have to go ahead and kill loads of enemies and defeat bosses, and then you gather resources in order to build up your loyal village of cult followers and become more and more powerful. So the game is really fun with tons of replayability. It sold a huge amount of copies for an indie game back in its release in 2022, and is definitely a worthy addition to your Mac gaming library. So next up is Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe. So this is the remake of the 2013 Stanley Parable and contains a whole bunch of new content compared to the original release. So if you've never played this game before, I describe it as an ironic, self-aware comedy game, which is all in first person, and it's all about your interactions with this knowing narrator.
If you can truly place your faith in another, then pick up the phone.
Stanley, did you just unplug the phone? No, that wasn't supposed to be a choice. How did you do that?
So this game isn't necessarily for everyone. It's quite linear in the sense that there are multiple branching paths and tons of different endings, but it's not exactly an action-packed, high-octane action game. It's really all about the comedy, even though the main gameplay loop is basically walking simulator. But make sure to definitely check out this title because I think it's very funny.
So next up is Call of Duty Black Ops 3. So I've put this on the list because this is actually the only Call of Duty game that actually runs well on Apple Silicon Macs. This did come out in 2015, and it is an Intel build with a Metal Graphics API port, so it actually runs really well, especially the single player game. You should definitely not be buying this game for multiplayer because the macOS version of the game is siphoned off from the rest of the world and cannot play with Windows users. So you definitely shouldn't be buying the multiplayer starter pack because that only contains the multiplayer, which is basically dead. What you should be getting is this one called the Zombie Chronicles Edition, which also contains the base game. So definitely pick this up if you don't already own it and you want access to a really high quality AAA first person shooter better, that works great on Apple Silicon Macs.
So next up is Civilization 6, the turn-based 4X strategy game, which I'm sure needs no introduction. So similar to previous installments of the game, the goal of the player is to develop a civilization from an early settlement to eventually become a world power and achieve one of several victory conditions, including technological superiority, cultural influence, and of course military domination. Now the original base game itself is actually quite old. It was originally released back in 2016, but it has tons of DLC, which is all really worth checking out. The gameplay loop is extremely addictive, and the DLCs give this game tons of longevity.
So next up is Total War Pharaoh. So this is the latest entry in the Total War series, and it's a historical title. And this time the game is set in the times of ancient Egypt. So if you're not familiar with this series, it basically combines grand turn-based strategy on an overworld map, and basically everything that you do in this grand strategy mode also affects the real-time gameplay too, so you can control the armies that you develop in the grand strategy and play them in real time against the enemy. So this game has got dozens of different factions and leaders to choose from, all of them with different strategies and gameplay that you can try out. And as with every historical Total War title, there is tons of replay value to be had. Now, quite controversially, people have had a bit of a backlash to this game because of its over-monetization and underdevelopment. And Creative Assembly have basically responded to this by lowering the price of the game and promising free DLC packs. So this is a really good time to get into this game, especially because it has a decent macOS port that performs well on most Macs. So if you want to try out the latest entry in the Total War series, then this is a good place to start. But you can also try older titles that work great as well. For example, Shogun 2 is one of my favorites, and it still works great on Apple Silicon hardware. So next up is Terra Nil. So this is an indie strategy video game. You as a player are tasked with turning a barren wasteland into an ecological paradise using technology like toxin scrubbers and these wind turbines. Basically, the task is to plant as much grass as possible and turn the landscape into this lush ecosystem. So there's a careful management of all of the game's resources and placement, so you have to be quite strategic with how you place all of the water, energy, seed planters, rocks, rivers, etc. And then what happens at the end is that you have to recycle the buildings in order to create an airship in order to leave the map. And the goal is to leave behind this rewilded paradise. So describe this game as a very relaxed strategy game. So it's all kind of turn-based. There's no real-time elements as far as I can tell. And you can undo actions all the way back to the beginning. So basically it's a strict kind of puzzle game. So you have to unfold the map bit by bit. If you make a mistake, you can basically undo and then repeat the process, which you're inevitably going to have to do in order to maximize the resource points that you can get from any particular map. Anyway, there's something kind of relaxing about playing this game with its satisfying visuals and sounds and music, and it all comes together as a complete satisfying experience. So next up is the game Firmament, which is an adventure game developed by Psychonauts, who are famous for the creation of the game Myst. So if you're familiar with that type of game, it's basically this first-person puzzle game. You wake up in this mysterious bunker with no memories, and you're confronted by this weird ghost who asks you to pick up this device called the Adjunct, which allows you to basically interact with all of the puzzles in the game. And the idea is that you raise control spires in each of the 3 realms, solving puzzles to unlock new areas of the environment to visit. So whether you like this kind of game will really depend on if you like these kind of slow-paced puzzle games like Myst. What makes this game a little bit more engaging, I would say, is the fact that we have this mentor character who basically voices dialogue in the background and directs you to new areas. And there's an interesting overarching storyline which takes place with a few twists and turns. So if you like this kind of puzzle game, then make sure to check this out. So next up is Disco Elysium, the Final Cut. So I described this as a kind of RPG adventure game, and it is insanely in-depth how deep the conversations and RPG stats go. For example, in one bit at the beginning of the game, I'm trying to slip away unnoticed. However, I basically fail the dice roll. Because of the character traits I selected, my character decides to dive away while flipping off the bartender, not noticing that there's a lady in a wheelchair right behind me. I haven't played too much of this, but it does have a very good macOS port that runs fantastically even on the base M1.
This game also frequently goes on sale for very low prices and is one of the best examples of a role-playing game on the Mac, so make sure to check it out.
So next up is the game Hades, which is made by the same developers as the game Bastion and Transistor. sister. And this is basically an action RPG roguelike. And basically every time you die, you learn a little bit more and you get slightly more powerful. There are tons of different weapons and abilities and also synergies and strategies that are going to be different every single time you play the game.
So of course, the release of Hades 2, the sequel, is just around the corner and it's going to get a macOS port, but in early access now it's only on Windows. But if you want to play the sequel instead, you can actually run the game very well through crossover. But if you're looking for a native Mac port, then Hades 1 is pretty good too, especially if you haven't tried it before.
So next up is Inscryption, which is this very atmospheric, lo-fi kind of card deck building roguelike game. It was first released in October 2021, but it got a macOS port
in mid 2022,
and this runs natively on macOS hardware. It's basically a deck building game where you can go ahead and choose different paths and fight different enemies and bosses. There are definitely some surprises on the way. It has some really excellent reviews, so there's a lot more than meets the eye, so make sure to check this out. So next up is Vampire Survivors. So personally, this is one of the most played games that I've played this year, especially on macOS. It runs natively and it has a huge amount of content, especially for the tiny price. So Vampire Survivors basically triggered this entire new genre. Well, it's kind of like a bullet hell game with roguelike elements, and you don't really fire weapons, you kind of move around while enemies come towards you, and you have to collect currency in order to level up your character and then evolve different weapon types. So the graphics look kind of very lo-fi, but trust me, this is a really cool game. I really like playing this. It's also got a recent iOS port as well, which is free, but nothing beats playing this on a big screen on a Mac. So next up is Divinity Original Sin 2 Definitive Edition. So this is the final version of the game, and this contains an insane amount of content. So if you don't know about this game, it's basically a very in-depth turn-based RPG. You have a party of 4 different characters, and you basically go around doing a whole load of quests. There's also a co-op mode as well, and there's actually hundreds of hours of content in this Definitive Edition.
It's also made by the same developers as Baldur's Gate 3, Larian Studios. So if you liked Baldur's Gate 3, then you're probably going to like Divinity Original Sin 2. Make sure to check it out on Mac.
So next up is the game Psychonauts 2. So this was originally released on PC in August 2021. However, it got its macOS port in mid 2022. So this is a very recent game. It is basically the sequel to the original Psychonauts game, which came out in 2005, which was really fantastic to begin with. And now we have a really high budget action platforming comedy game. It has some of the most interesting level and character design you're going to find on macOS. It comes from the mind of Tim Schafer, so expect lots of humor and jokes, and also really great gameplay as well.
So anyway, I hope you found this list interesting. If you think any other Steam Mac games deserve to be on this list in the future, then please make sure to leave a comment suggesting it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.